It all started with a simple request, a glass of water. But the flight attendant's response sparked something unexpected. And in just a few short minutes, that otherwise uneventful flight became an unforgettable memory for all the passengers present that day. Business class plane took off from Atlanta in the early afternoon, gradually stabilizing its altitude in the clear blue sky. Sunlight streamed through the small windows, spreading like soft yellow streaks across the rows of seats and dining tables in front of them. The atmosphere in the cabin was quiet, as if the whole world was suspended in the clouds, completely isolated from the noise and rush below. The passengers were already seated, some with headphones on, some flipping through books, some taking a nap. And in row 3A of first class, Jamal Brooks was leaning back in his seat, his eyes quietly looking out at the sky through the small window. Jamal was a 34-year-old black businessman with a calm face and an easygoing demeanor. He wore a dark suit, a neat collar, and a silver-pinned tie. Despite having just finished a week of presentations and negotiations, he showed no signs of fatigue. Only a quiet gaze, as if he were putting everything aside to find a few brief moments of peace in the windless sky. He was used to long flights, to airports, and tight schedules. But today, there was something in the air that bothered him. It wasn't the noise or the glitches. The flight had been completely smooth. But it was something small, subtle, something that only someone who had kept quiet for so long would notice. He noticed as the stewardess, what was her name, came to serve the passengers in this compartment. She smiled brightly at the white man in seat 2A, but as she passed Jamal, the smile disappeared, replaced by a cold glance that passed quickly and then turned away. No greeting, no minimal nod as she did with the others. Just a look of aversion, of concern, as if his presence made her uncomfortable. Jamal didn't respond. He was used to such indifference. He had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the loudest voice. But despite all the years of cultivating calm, the feeling still crept inside him, like a cool breeze through his shirt. He exhaled softly, adjusted his posture, and reached down to retrieve the leather notebook from his briefcase. Among the pages of notes about strategy and clients, there was a small piece of paper drawn in crayon, a lopsided airplane, and a man labeled Daddy in childish handwriting, a gift his daughter had drawn the night before he left. Jamal smiled, a smile so gentle it melted the icy air. And then, in that seemingly warm moment, he gently reached out and pressed the button to call the flight attendant. Not expecting much, just a glass of water. Little did he know that the woman's reaction would set off a chain of events that no one on the flight that day could have expected. A soft click sounded as the call button lit up on the business class ceiling. Jamal sat still, his hands folded, his gaze still polite, like a man well-versed in airborne formalities. There was no rush or urgency in his demeanor, just a man in need of a drink after hours of hard work. A few minutes later, a flight attendant walked up from the front of the cabin. It was Karen, a white woman in her mid-40s, her blonde hair pulled back into a bun, her uniform immaculate. Her face was familiar to Jamal. He'd seen her on a few flights before, but today there was something about that struck him as off. It wasn't her looks, it was her presence. There was something in Karen's eyes, a fleeting avoidance, a forced smile, not natural enough to be friendly, but not obvious enough to be rude. "We're a little busy, sir. Please wait a moment," she said, her voice still professional, but lacking the warmth usually associated with business class. There was no eye contact, no nod, no further inquiry. She turned away quickly, as if his presence made her uncomfortable. Jamal raised an eyebrow, not too clearly, just a slight reflex. He'd seen something. Karen had said she was busy, but just before she'd reached him, she'd served juice to the white man sitting to his left, same row, less than an arm's length away. And she'd done it in a different tone, lighter, more cheerful, even adding a little joke. "Don't drink too much. We don't want you using the restroom every 10 minutes. The man laughed, returning a playful wink. Yet when it was his turn, with a simple request, Karen left only a short and cold message. No one else noticed it. No one looked at that moment with eyes sharp enough to notice the small difference, but enough to scratch a man's self-esteem. But Jamal did. He had lived too long to notice that kind of invisible gap, not gross enough to cause an overt reaction, but not subtle enough not to make someone's heart ache. He took a deep breath. In that brief moment, part of him wanted to speak up, but he knew exactly when to speak and when to observe. The quality of an entrepreneur lies not in responding to every strange look, but in waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Because sometimes the worst things don't come from the obvious blows, but from the silent scratches people pretend not to see. The plane was still flying steadily through the air, the sky outside stretched out with the early afternoon sunlight shining through each window, illuminating the faces of the passengers with soft streaks of light. No one knew that in the business class seat number 2A, a small wave had just begun to roll in, not because of the noise or collision, but because of the excessive silence of a simple action. Jamal remained seated, hands in his lap, eyes fixed on the small curtain that separated the business class cabin from the galley. He was used to waiting. But what he couldn't help but notice was that when Karen returned, it wasn't to bring him water. She pushed the cart smoothly down the aisle, but then stopped abruptly at the opposite row. With a smile that could not hide her favor, Karen bowed slightly and handed the glass of cool orange juice to another passenger. A middle-aged white woman with silver hair falling over her shoulders, reading a book. The woman nodded her thanks, a little surprised that she had not requested anything, but then smiled and accepted it, not noticing anything unusual. It was then that Emily, a white woman sitting just 2 seats away from Jamal, began to sense something was wrong. She had seen Karen refuse Jamal's request just minutes before, and now she was bringing someone else water without being asked. Her eyes narrowed, and her gaze briefly glanced at Jamal. A trace of awkwardness rose in her heart. Karen walked past Jamal without saying anything. But then, as if feeling the pressure of that silent gaze, she stopped abruptly. Not to serve, but to warn. "Sir, I told you to wait. Please don't push the button again unless it's an emergency." The words were not spoken loudly, but clear enough for the nearby seats to hear. Her voice did not carry anger, but was cold and creepy, as if he had just done something wrong. The business class cabin fell silent for a beat. Jamal raised his head and looked straight into her eyes. There was no anger in his gaze, just a calmness that was disconcerting. He replied, his voice low and clear, "I only asked for water, like everyone else." Not a word wasted, not a word raised, but the air seemed to freeze. A few of the passengers around her turned slightly. Emily now fully realized what was happening. This was not a routine delay, nor was it laziness. This was a choice, on purpose. Karen pursed her lips, momentarily confused, then turned away without another word. But the silence she left behind was no longer an indifference, it was a confession in action. In that moment, no shouting, no heated confrontation, was enough to crack the veneer of politeness that had been used to conceal hidden prejudices. On that plane, high in the sky, something began to come to light, and it was no longer so easy to hide. The air in the business class cabin was still quiet, but the silence now carried a different feeling, no longer peaceful, but as if waiting for something to happen, something that could not be ignored. From the front of the plane, a young figure appeared. Neat uniform, professional demeanor. It was Lucas, the chief flight attendant of today's flight. Just a few steps towards row 2A, his eyes quickly swept over Jamal's face, and in an instant, Lucas understood that he was entering a situation that was no longer simply about serving passengers. He bowed slightly, his voice calm but sincere. "Sir, I'm so sorry for the delay. Let me take care of that for you right away." Without a word, Lucas turned back to the preparation area and returned less than a minute later with a glass of water placed carefully on a clean napkin. As he bent down to hand the glass to Jamal, their eyes met, not in confrontation, but in recognition. Jamal took the glass of water with both hands, nodding slightly, but then he looked up and asked, not loudly, not harshly, just a simple question, but with the weight of the sky behind it. Why was I the only one who had to ask twice? The room fell silent. Lucas straightened. Something shifted in his eyes, not confusion, but recognition. He didn't answer right away, just stood there for a few seconds, as if considering not an excuse, but a way to face the truth. After a deep breath, Lucas turned around, his eyes fixed on the back of the compartment, where Karen was trying to avoid all eyes by pretending to adjust the food trays. "Karen," His voice was not loud, but firm. "Can I speak to you in the back for a moment?" The surrounding passengers, who had initially been curious, began to sense the tension in the air. Emily glanced at Jamal, her gaze now supportive. Gentle but firm, Karen paused, momentarily stunned, before turning her head. For a brief moment, her eyes flickered to Jamal, no longer averted, but a small flash of anger obscured by confusion. She stood, nodded to Lucas, and walked toward the back of the plane, where the curtains closed, leaving behind a silent cabin. And something began to shift. No one in the business class needed to say it, but everyone understood. The familiar order had just been challenged. And this time, the one taking the lead was no longer the man in uniform, but the one who quietly demanded justice. Just a small question. But it could not be ignored. No one expected that, in the quiet and somewhat conservative business class, there was someone quietly recording everything. From the moment Jamal pressed the water button for the first time, to Karen's evasive gaze, her unfair tone, and even the way she turned away to serve someone else. The person recording the video was a young passenger sitting in the back. Petite, wearing headphones, but his eyes never left the abnormality that was happening from beginning to end. His phone was tucked discreetly into the pocket of his jacket, which hung loosely on the front seat. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to see every detail, enough to distinguish between politeness and indifference, between carelessness and intentionality. Behind the curtain, a short but tense meeting took place. Lucas stood between Karen and the captain, a middle-aged man with a quiet face but stern eyes. No one raised their voice. They didn't need to. Everything was too clear. A few minutes later, Lucas emerged from the rear cabin. He stood in the middle of the business class cabin, where all eyes were now on him, as if waiting for something, an explanation, or at least an acknowledgement. He picked up the microphone. His clear but soft voice resounded in the quiet space. "Ladies and gentlemen, we sincerely apologize for the incident earlier. After reviewing the situation, we've made an internal decision." He paused for a beat. "The flight attendant in question will be removed from her duties for the remainder of this flight. No applause, no whistles." But that silence was louder than any applause. It was confirmation that the injustice had been seen and not ignored. Karen stepped behind Lucas, clutching her uniform apron, her face rigid. She said nothing, no apology, no justification, just walked silently through the passenger compartment, where every eye that followed her was a mirror. Shock, disappointment, and silent understanding. Emily, the middle-aged woman sitting next to him, tilted her head slightly, her gaze meeting Jamal's in a wordless sharing. As for Jamal, he did not smile triumphantly, nor did he gloat. He just sat there, his hand still resting lightly on the cold glass of water, his eyes staring straight ahead. Because he understood. This was not a victory. This was just a moment when a truth, no matter how small, could shake a seemingly immutable system. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, casting a soft glow across Jamal's face. He sat there, the business class cabin now empty. No more clinking cups, no more questioning eyes. There was only the hum of the engines and a silence long enough for him to listen to himself. The glass of water was still in his hand, the coolness gone. But it had never been about water. And now, looking back, he understood better than anyone. What stirred his heart was not thirst, but the feeling of being ignored. Of being ignored in a place that should have been fair. The plane door opened. Pale yellow light flooded in, and passengers slowly stood up. As Jamal approached the exit, a hand gently rested on his shoulder. It was Emily, the middle-aged woman he had seen looking at him from across the room. Her voice was as soft as a whisper. "Thank you for standing up. We saw it too." Jamal just nodded. Words were inadequate to describe what he felt. Not just gratitude, but a sense of connection, of being understood by at least one person. His car glided through the city streets as evening fell. Streetlights flickered in the distance, and he sat in the back, holding his phone. The screen lit up with hundreds of shares, comments, and a video that was going viral. Below the clip was a quiet but powerful hashtag, "Respect in the Sky." Jamal opened the status bar. His fingers paused for a moment, then he slowly typed out a few lines. Not an accusation, not an exposure. Just a simple sharing coming from the deepest part of him. It was never about water, it was about being seen, being respected. He pressed send. Then he put the phone down and leaned his head against the window, the lights passing by his eyes like stars across the night sky. In that moment, he felt no anger, only a strange peace. The kind of peace that comes when one chooses to stand up, not to fight, but to remind the world that one is worth seeing. That night, the hotel room on the upper floor was quietly bathed in warm yellow light. The curtains were half closed, leaving a small gap through which the streetlights filtered in, drawing faint lines on the ceiling. Jamal lay quietly on the bed, one hand resting on his forehead, eyes open, but not looking at anything in particular. The room was quiet, except for the gentle breathing of the air conditioner, like a lullaby at the end of the day. The phone lay beside him, the screen dark. The messages kept coming, the words of support kept popping up, but Jamal stopped following them. Not because he was indifferent, but because what he needed right now wasn't in those short lines. What he felt was a pause. Not anger, not triumph, but a sense of lightness, as if something inside him had been set down after a long struggle. Sometimes, he thought to himself, all it takes is someone saying, "This isn't okay." It was no grand gesture, no slogans, no speeches, no raised fists, just a look at the truth, a voice that neither screamed nor was silent. And he knew, today, he did it. In a simple way, but enough to make people look back. He didn't expect the clip to go viral. He didn't expect people to remember his name. What he hoped was that, at the end of the day, someone, a passenger, a flight attendant, a child who happened to see the video, would remember this. That respect is not a privilege. It's the bare minimum, something we all deserve simply because we're human. In a world that moves too fast, Jamal closed his eyes, feeling his eyelids grow heavier as his breathing evened out. The small acts, the quiet stands, are the ones that truly matter. No one knows what tomorrow will bring, but right now, in the quiet room of a man who has just spoken his mind, the world becomes a little fairer. And sometimes just a little bit is enough.